Welcome back to the Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I am Dr. Tabish, and this is where we dive into the stories of people who build, who survive, and who find ways to create meaning and value even when the world around them is falling apart. Right now, as we speak, over 360 million people globally, they are in need of humanitarian assistance, the highest number in modern history. From Gaza to Ukraine to countless overlooked crises, people are not just waiting for help, they're creating their own lifelines. And they're doing so often with nothing but determination and ingenuity. In this podcast, we look beyond boardrooms, we look beyond growth projections into the forgotten corners of the world where entrepreneurship and resilience, they mean something much more raw, more urgent, and more deeply human. And today I'm honored to sit down with someone who embodies this ethos in every sense, Marina Kobzeva. Marina has spent nearly 2 decades working in some of the most challenging humanitarian contexts. She's been leading teams for Red Cross, for UN agencies, and so many of the grassroots NGOs. But what makes her story remarkable and so aligned with this podcast is that she hasn't just been on the giving end of humanitarian work. She's also stood on the receiving end. She knows personally what it means when systems collapse, and survival depends on far more than just the handout. She tells us it all depends on human ingenuity, dignity, and quiet resilience. So, Marina, for us, is not just a practitioner. She's a fierce voice for locally led humanitarian response. And with the human catastrophe unfolding right now in Gaza, where survival and dignity and resilience are being tested every day alongside ongoing crises in places like Ukraine and beyond. This conversation could not be more timely or necessary. And according to the UN, over 2 million people in Gaza right now are living under siege conditions, with essential services collapsing, which makes this conversation like this not just relevant, but very, very urgent. Marina, welcome to the Builders of Broken Bazaar. I'm so glad to have you here. I want to start with something that's not the usual opening question when you're in a conversation like this. You have written so much about your own experience as a recipient of humanitarian assistance, and now you spent nearly 2 decades working in this sector. So this journey from the recipient to the leader is very rare. Can you please take us back to that earlier experience, and what was it like being on the receiving end of aid?
Thank you for having me. It really was quite a formative experience to me, and I don't think I gave it enough credit until quite recently as to just how much it shaped me in my career choices and the choice of what I work on within the humanitarian sector. So going back to that time, I was 9 and I lived in, by the time, already post-Soviet Azerbaijan. The situation was worsening by the day. I obviously was a child, so I don't remember any significant hardship. But I also know that my parents are not big fans of speaking about those times. So I understand as grown-ups, they had to go through quite a bit more juggling of our dwindling resources than I was privy to. So at some point in time, my dad showed up at home with big brown cardboard boxes, all covered in foreign writing. And we tore into them with my little brother. So I was 9, he was 3. And yeah, we opened it up and it had a ton of different items, mostly food, bread, jam, there was rice, I think. There was some packaged meat. I don't know what it was, pate, something. And there were even things we only saw in films, like peanut butter, I think it was. And it was something I only knew from movies. And then we found something else there in the bottom of the box that looked like pills. And I remember my parents quickly swooped in and ripped it out of our hands. And for fear that we would also try to taste it. And they couldn't figure it out because it was all written in a foreign language they didn't speak. And eventually, with the help of the neighbors, we figured out those were chlorine tablets, water purification tablets. And that meant really nothing to me, but I overheard the conversation my parents had in the kitchen later that night when I think it was my dad who said, where do they think we live? And it was such a weird tension that I could hear my parents share. On the one hand, there was this massive, deep gratitude that somebody, we learned it was West Germany, cared, or at the time it was United Germany already, I guess, cared so much about us, people in a completely different part of the continent, cared enough to send something to people they would never meet. Yet it felt like some of the assumptions about our context were grounded in, I don't know, stereotypes of people, what people who might want to receive humanitarian assistance live in. And that's dumb.
It seems like a very profound experience, especially when you're that young. And now that you reflect back on it, when you are here right now in terms of shaping, experiences of a lot of the others, who are struggling right now, does it stick with you in terms of decisions you make on a day-to-day basis? Does it actually shape the decision which you make?
Absolutely. Definitely does. And I think that's been a glance into the reality of many people, the reality that many people still live today. Mm-hmm. More and more people are living, actually, considering that the world is in the middle of so many humanitarian crises, many of them protracted and that are less and less funded. So that means that choices that stand in front of the people making decisions and people waiting to receive assistance are ever more complex. And I think one of the things that it constantly reminds me of is that nobody wants to be receiving humanitarian assistance. Nobody wants.
I cannot agree more. When there are more than 120 million people who've been forcibly displaced, the path you have chosen, Marina, is absolutely fabulous, which is why having you on this podcast is such an ode to the theme of what we are trying to do here. A lot of things you say, you also say things about, informal conversations. That reminds me of a corporate world, although, it's an antithesis to what we are trying to do here. But, in a sector where we're talking about more than 90% of the funding, that often goes to the large international agencies. And many of them, they are headquartered in formal regional colonies. How does then that funding, according to you and what you have seen, how does it actually go into the formal spaces through the conversation people are having? And do you think it is very different to the corporate world? For example, decision making.
Yeah.
You meet someone in the corridors and you have that discussion. But then how does it operate in your sector? How does it work for you? Do you have similar discussion, summarization, which actually forms into the policies?
Of course, there are places where decisions are made. Depends on the scale of the decisions. Those can be places either very close to where the communities affected by crises find themselves, or can be as remote as those global capitals where many of these large organizations that you're talking about are headquartered. Obviously, a lot of the assistance in the so-called official, formal humanitarian sector is coming through the donor governments. We all heard about the recent issue, which is a massive understatement, with the dismantling of the US agency. Yeah. And that means that 60% the funding is gone. That was quite a decision, showing you how one decision by one human being or a couple of human beings can really have a massive ripple effect on literally millions of people.
As such, there was a funding gap, up until the end of 2023, you were talking about around 25 billion. And just in 2 years, with all what is happening in Europe and USA, we are talking about crossing 50 billion threshold. Now, these might be numbers, but the impact it has on people is absolutely unbelievable. And you are seeing that in your own way, isn't it?
There are over 70 million people who are directly impacted by the cuts currently. And I'm not speaking only about the cuts that come from the United States. Many European donor agencies are also cutting their funding, have announced the cuts, and they are going to either slowly reduce their funding, like the UK government, for example, or other European governments too. Belgium, the Netherlands, I don't want to single anyone out, but it's a trend, right? And these decisions, these are the biggest, highest stakes decisions, and they are made as far away from communities as can be.
Yeah, you're quite right. It has set the precedent. And which is where me coming from an entrepreneurship, coming from an academic world, we see things more philosophically. So when you look at the political landscape of United Kingdom, what's happening now, what Keir Starmer is doing, or before that, what Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak did, people look at it in isolation. But it all started. If you go back, we're talking about David Cameron, setting up that stall for his big society, cutting those funding, and the following leaders, they took the bait on it and they carried on doing what he started. So it's just that when leadership or when leaders are in that, when they start doing something, it's quite obvious, the institutions follow. And that's what we are seeing right now. But then that brings me, Marina, to something again you're very close, which is why I wanted to speak to you about this. Despite all this happening at the top level, despite happening at different institutions level, you have people at the bottom, people on the ground, people suffering. You must have seen that kind of grassroots resilience and problem solving, because they need food, they need that support, they need that hospital care, they need everything which you need in order to survive in a very, very difficult environment. So how would you summarize that? How do they go about doing this?
I think I would like to start with addressing something that might be a misconception, and I'm not saying that you're part of it, but it certainly is quite prevalent in this part of the world. It's kind of generalized, that with the end of humanitarian aid or with its dwindling, people are completely left on their own. I mean, it's on the one hand true that many people will die because of the cuts. It's just there is no sugarcoating it. But on the other hand, it would be wrong to say that the resilience that is being built within the communities that find themselves in very difficult circumstances at the intersection of, climate change, conflict, poverty, intensifying emergencies, and protracted crises, has always been built through all these official overseas development assistance funding. There's a ton of innovation, entrepreneurship that's happening, has always been happening, and will always happen in those communities, regardless of foreign aid being or not being present. What foreign aid could do is to elevate that, to support it, to provide more safety nets in those cases where the governments in those countries are not able to do it because they don't have, the fiscal base for that, for example. But in principle, it's always been there. And there are many other massively influential actors globally that are supporting and could be supporting this building of resilience. I know resilience is a charged word because resilience is how you respond to crisis when you're almost broken. So in principle, we do celebrate it. But on the other hand, it would be great if people didn't have to get so resilient, if they could actually thrive, right? Instead of constantly surviving and building their kind of survival muscle. But there are diaspora funders globally that are funding the communities back home. Like right now, Sudanese diaspora is very active, supporting people internally displaced by the conflict in Sudan, which is the largest humanitarian crisis right now. Obviously, there is a massive Ukrainian diaspora. There's a Congolese diaspora supporting people displaced within DRC and outside of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Diaspora is a massive in people, and it dwarfs the official development assistance. It's investment back into its communities back home. But then there are also philanthropists and high net worth individuals. And I wouldn't say they've been stepping up quite significantly to speak about it, but there has been also an investment through other channels that are not necessarily confined within this official humanitarian architecture. And there should be more of that as well. And I think for us to hopefully support enabling it, we need to change narratives about those communities, not as passive victims waiting to be rescued and saved, but as people who have the know-how, who have this entrepreneurial drive, who want exactly the same things for their families as you want, I want, Keir Starmer wants, and who just sometimes, because of the circumstances in which they find themselves, and which is through no fault of their own, leg up to on that vision, entrepreneurial drive, and desire to sustain their own communities, their families, and themselves.
Absolutely. And that would mean we look at them first eye to eye. as human beings and making sure we give them what we expect of ourselves. But I think it also points to the fact that in the Western world, we are used to categorizing things in a very formal way. We like formal things in this part of the world. It doesn't mess with your brain. And we all know the problem with that is what is happening right now in Gaza or Ukraine or even Sudan is all a product of how we like to see the world, how the Western world wants things to work out rather than giving the autonomy to the local citizens. They know their context, they know how it operates for them. But what I'm taking away from what you just mentioned, this is for the audience, we need something more intrinsic, something more internal, something more contextualized before other agencies could really come in and ring fence the problem, and then offer that solution. But what is happening right now, the contextualized part is completely shattered. Like in Gaza, we talk about formal system, it doesn't exist. Obviously, international aid, we are hearing about all the stories, what is happening. There's nothing which exists. So no matter how much you pour in from outside, it really won't have that sort of impact which it should, or which people expect in the Western world to have. Am I correct in understanding that, Marina?
I think pouring in from the outside would definitely be much more effective if it were based on the needs and expressed by people, support, and on our better understanding of their realities.
Yeah.
I've seen so many aid programs, really well intentioned, and I never question intentions, right? Because they're always good. People always want to support, they always want to help, they always want to uplift those other people. But as long as we treat them as passive recipients or as less than ourselves, then it's much harder to genuinely engage with them and their context. Step away from this assumption that we already know what they want.
I like the word intention and the way you've used it as well, because that is misplaced in cases what we are seeing right now. And that brings me to my next question of systems which are actually working, systems which have actually managed to disrupt the existing ecosystem in and around. It could be anywhere. And have you seen that in the last 20 years? And it seems to have paved the way for the local enterprise or the local resilience of going forward.
I mean, I have to be frank.
Mm-hmm.
Aid sector turns to be a bubble. There are a few initiatives within the sector that looks outside and encourages us partnering with private sector entities, for example, etc. However, I've seen greater engagement with mutual aid networks. This is something that's obviously existed before the dawn of times. People always, I mean, it would be a bit cheeky to call it innovation. What's innovative about it is the fact that we are finally recognizing it and are engaging with it. And I know that within the context where there is no access for international actors or very strained and limited access, these mutual aid organizations, networks, movements, they're normally not even organizations, right? They're just neighbors helping neighbors, communities organizing, pooling resources, whatever little they have. Maybe they have an injection of those remittances or something else from the diaspora. This is something that the humanitarian sector is finally starting to recognize. And these networks are definitely a lifeline in some of the contexts, like Sudan, for example. There is a network of, if I'm not wrong, over 1,000 of emergency response rooms in Sudan, where basically communities are coming together, organizing those spaces where they address their most immediate needs, be it medical, education, food, hygiene, etc. And people pool resources to understand how best their immediate needs can be solved. Right now, international actors are starting to recognize that there are already existing systems. Instead of trying to build parallel structures or sitting and waiting until access becomes possible, the way to support those in a way that is absolutely most genuine, with the greatest multiplier effect, because a lot of cash being injected directly into communities is the best way to not only uphold their dignity, when make choices about what's, what they're going to invest that cash into, but also to make sure that their most immediate needs are met in the ways that they would prioritize. And the same was true for Gaza until, I would say, quite recently. I think currently it's harder to donate into Gaza. I know many crowdfunding platforms are restricting donations into Gaza, so even people who are trying to support Gazan families inside the Strip are struggling to just actually send money there. But still, you could read a few reports by Ground Truth Solutions, for example, an organization that, talks to communities to understand whether their needs are being met by aid organizations. You could see that mutual aid was massive within Gaza in the first year after October the 7th, 2023. And in contexts like Myanmar, where access is tricky and it's highly regulated, there is also thriving networks of mutual aid.
Yeah.
Again, neighbors help each other. I know when we speak about innovation, it's really tempting to tie it to tech development or something like that. And innovation is just bringing together the unlikely partners and helping them, reinforce each other's missions by pooling resources and the know-how, etc., and removing those barriers created by false narratives, simplifying narratives about who makes decisions, who knows better, and who is the hero here in this particular.
You've picked up from a few points here, which are very, very important. The first thing is the recognition of what has been happening within the sector. Coming from outside and having a playbook of Silicon Valley corporate, innovation and entrepreneurship, that recognition was always there within the humanitarian sector. What is important now is that recognition needs to get out of that sector, and other stakeholders of the society look at that. And you and me have a part in that. We speak to hundreds of students. We speak to so many businesses. We speak to the entrepreneurs in and around us. Do they know this? Are they aware of this? Are we writing enough article about it? Are we publicizing this enough? And like you said about the innovation as well, this is what we want to change as part of this podcast. The definition of innovation. It is not a monopoly of the tech sector. And we want to bring that in our classroom. We want to bring that in our case studies, which is why voices like you are very, very important, Marina. If you look at business schools, there are more than 200 universities across the United Kingdom. There are less than 10% of those business school, case studies, which comes from a non-Western context or crisis-affected context. We celebrate the disruption of Uber and Airbnb. How can we celebrate this? What do we need for this so that it becomes front and center to the students, to the faculty, to the researchers? What are we missing?
It does. I am just very careful with how I say it because I'm wondering, words matter, right? How you describe things and places and people matters a lot. And I would like to start by saying that we need to stop treating the places where my sector works as hopeless places of just need, right?
So who's to blame for that, Marina? Who's to blame for that word, that narrative? Where do we go for that? And who should we point fingers at?
I mean, it depends how deep we want to dig, right? On the one hand, we can say, okay, at the surface level, we could say this is aid organizations. They minimize those communities into, just poor starving families or, those black and brown children with flies in their eyes to increase the fundraising returns. But that wouldn't be fair that it's just because of that. And the sector is actually moving away from it right now, from the so-called, poverty porn, where communities are flattened into these unhelpful single-story stereotypes about the lack, the deficiency, about what they don't have. But obviously, a lot of what we are dealing with is built on centuries of othering, right? Where the communities over there, just because they look slightly different, because they worship their gods slightly differently, they dress differently, oh my God, they speak with an accent, right? I mean, I saw it so many times, how I open my mouth and a native speaker leans in to make sure they read my lips to understand that what I'm saying. And I know that my English is fairly fluent, but it just sounds different and that sets off something, right? And I know that it's so much stronger when we speak about communities and places. It's lived, right? So, I think, of course, it's built on centuries of conditioning where there is us and then there is them. And of course, many of the institutions that are currently working across this divide, however manufactured the divide is, to reinforce it. A lot of the foreign policy, etc., is shaped in that space where maintaining the divide between us and them, us, the benevolent global north, for example, the West, Europe, whatever you call it, is so different to them, people out there starving, affected by disasters, etc. Although there's a ton of resources currently that would put us back on the straight and narrow in terms of these narratives. That would tell us that the most generous country, for example, where people are consistently giving most generously is Indonesia, right? Repeatedly, etc. So we need to, I think, to continue elevating these narratives that, people are, it's not the haves and have-nots. It's not the, noble saviors versus the helpless victims, but there's got to be some common good narrative emerging where, we supporting people who don't look like us, who don't live where we live, because it all translates into the common good for all of us. And I know it sounds very idealistic, and I guess you can't fault me for that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be probably working in this sector. Yeah. But something needs to be addressed in that space, because, when the funding cuts were happening at the end of January, the most dramatic ones, where many organizations that work in the sector where I work felt like the rug was being pulled from under them. Programs were halted, like overnight. Communities were told, "Don't come back tomorrow." Health clinics were being closed. And the questions. A couple of journalists contacted me, and the question that kept coming up was, could it be good? Could it be a blessing in disguise? Because maybe it will disrupt the aid dependency for communities. But that against that picture of a lazy community somewhere in the global south, most likely, sitting around waiting for handouts. And that's just simply not true.
But then aren't we looking at it in a very isolated way? Those conditions have been created. Those conditions have been created pre what is happening now. And now when the responsibility lies in making sure, you are looking after that community in whatever way possible, you are withdrawing yourself because constraint within your own country is getting a bit stretched up. Your healthcare is suffering. You're talking about migrant crisis. You're talking about so many different things. So it's not driven by what you've done for them. It's driven by what is happening to you internally.
Of course, yeah. And that's so easy. And there is this belief that aid budgets within the global north spending plans are an easy target because they don't have any home constituents, or they don't have enough home constituents who would stand up and speak up to their governments against the aid cuts. And I know in the UK, the civil society is thriving and a powerful one, and many international aid agencies did speak up about the cuts when they were announced here. And it was like, yes, well, yeah, we're doing it with a heavy heart, but we will hopefully reconsider it in the future. But so far, it is what it is, right? And there is no critical mass of public support.
You mentioned you were very positive with the thriving of the society that way, putting pressure on the government. But is it actually working? Is it actually making a difference? Because what you see is a real pattern here, where the public narrative or the public opinion has completely, no one seems to be bothered. If you seem to be bothered about it, they seem to categorize you in a particular box and say, okay, you belong to this ideology and you are not making sense.
It's very disappointing. I'm just trying to be very careful with my words here. Because, I, as a young...
You can be as honest as possible.
I come from a place that's been othered for a long time, right?
Yeah.
I am Russian, and every time I say that, I can see people change in their face. I always have to come in with but I hate the war in Ukraine. I don't support it. Nobody in my family ever voted for Putin. I always have to make a ton of caveats before I kind of establish myself as somebody on the side of good, I can be trusted. You don't need to take 2 steps back. However, I must say that growing up behind the Iron Curtain when I was really young, and later during the very difficult 90s back in Russia, we were always told that, this is the price you pay for democracy. This is the transition to democracy. Mm-hmm. And while I recognize that what's happening in Russia is now as far from democracy as it can possibly be, I always believed, and I come from this weird generation where we still remember a bit of the Soviet Union. We still remember the 90s with their poverty, but their freedom too. Mm-hmm. So unlike my brother, who is 6 years younger, he doesn't remember that decade. And I do. And I know that freedom of speech, democracy, all of that, it's possible. We were always told that there is the West, in Russia, it's always the West, where the democracy is real. It's a real thing. People elect other people to represent them, and then they have influence over them. I will be honest with you. I moved here 8 years ago after already not living in Russia for a few years, working and living internationally. And this has been one of the biggest disappointments of my life. It was one of the untested assumptions that I guess carried without examining it too much, recognizing that, yes, democracy, it's clearly way more real here than back home.
I believe that the Western nations have actually benefited from that, and large population of the world have given them that benefit of doubt. Because when you talk about democracy, and we've had a series of right wing, left wing, whatever you call that, but in terms of democracy, these countries has always looked upon likes of UK, likes of USA, and that has benefited. The Western world has gotten the best of that. But then you can't turn around and say, when you're pointing fingers at other countries and say, oh, you know what, we want to practice the kind of democracy which we do, which is very, very selective. We have to explain, we have to come out with explanation before we are accepted in that environment. But the old colonial patterns, it rises its head all the time. So our discussion in this podcast.
It was honest if we didn't bring it up. Right?
But when we're talking about sector as such, your sector, and you're a brave part of that sector, But when we look at Africa, we look at Asia, we look at Middle Eastern communities, their context is very different. But then all those decisions, so we revisit the whole thing, all those decisions about how they're going to live their life, how they're going to be enterprising, how entrepreneurial they are in nature, what sort of mindset they have. All these decisions are being made in London, Paris, and New York.
The measuring sticks that are also designed here, right?
I mean, we put in our grant application and we see how it comes across. Okay, we have to report on this, report on that. But then have you actually tried understanding? Has enough outreach programs been made or done or implemented to really understand why Israelis and Palestinians cannot live together? Or what is the challenge which one group of community in Myanmar is facing or Sudan is facing? No, absolutely not. You can see it's a barren table altogether, isn't it? First, I'll talk to you about accountability, and then we'll talk about the power as well. So where does this lie in terms of accountability? And we are covering a large surface area here.
Yeah, I know it's hard to. I mean, accountability has been my bread and butter for a long time. I think that early experience really informed that, if you give people something, they will feel grateful. They will feel grateful. Communities always feel very, very grateful for what they receive. I've never seen anyone turn down any aid box or cash grant. Of course not. Of course, people won't do that. But it's not always, or let's be honest, quite rarely shaped based on what communities told us they need, they want. It's a lot of the time based on the assumptions of what we assume they would need. And that's how the sector has worked for a very long time. And there are a few initiatives that have developed over the last few decades that are trying to put everyone who works in this sector, in this realm, into communities' shoes. There are a ton of initiatives that say that they are community-centric, or they want to make aid, humanitarian development, community-centric, informed by communities' needs. But the inertia in the sector is also quite strong, and often the time pressures are also quite powerful. So you often feel, okay, I don't have time to engage with communities, right? And a ton of case studies where it is proven time and again, engaging with communities, even in the, during acute crisis, just creates better outcomes, better, value for money, better value for money for those taxpayers that we're always getting referred to, when decisions are made about aid budgets, etc., or fraud. Does this fraud? Sometimes, sometimes it's a real thing, but not always. Again, speaking about measuring sticks, what's fraud here and what's fraud in a completely different context? Maybe it's not, right? And so the sector is scrutinized really, intensely, and it's under a lot of pressure to make sure that none of the expenditure appears to be fraudulent. However, quite seldom those projects are designed with communities' input, and that's where the biggest accountability gap is. And there are initiatives that are seeking to bridge the gap, but it's an uphill struggle. And that also proves that the direction in which accountability travels in the sector is still upward. if we assume that communities are at the bottom, and I understand it also does kind of has negative aftertaste to describe them at the bottom, and the donor is on top, most of the accountability is still quite upwards. The reporting, all those fraud, we are obsessed with it. We are easily spending £10 on fraud prevention to prevent £1 worth of fraud, right? Introduce multiple layers into this humanitarian architecture to make sure that, the global North governments give money only to those reputable organizations that now have their share taken out of it before they pass it down to an international NGO that would take its share to risk assure the programming, and before passing whatever's left to the local NGO that normally would do most of the work, receive peanuts and the bulk of risk assurance work, and then what's left is reaching the communities. While I recognize there are many accountability initiatives, movements, standards, and they're really needed, and they are slowly improving the sector. There are quite a few elephants in the room that are not being addressed about efficiencies, about effectiveness of our spending, and about how much communities really get to shape the assistance that's meant to change their lives, save their lives. Now we are being told that all of the assistance that we are providing needs to be life-saving. So do the communities get to define what life-saving is to them?
So it links to what then you feel the way colonial powers in the Western democracy, the way they have been operating for a very long time. Could it be a way that, you want to retain that power? You want to make sure you have never lived that crisis. You have never gone through that process, but you are the one who's designing by and for people you've never met. So how do you bring that contextualization? So it all comes down to retaining that power without being too critical of some of the former leaders of United Kingdom. They have made a lot of money out of this. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the play of power, isn't it?
Of course, power is not easily ceded, right? It's not something that I've seen people easily part with. And I think it's often masked or wrapped into quite sophisticated arguments about, well, we need to make decisions because we know better. We are experts. And for example, local organizations that have constantly done the bulk of the work of delivering humanitarian assistance, designing or implementing most of the time, really, humanitarian programs and projects, they are perceived to be low capacity and therefore not fit to make decisions and not fit to receive funding directly from those global entities that would much rather have it trickle down through multiple layers of this multi-story building before it reaches them. So grabbing onto the power has been...
It's a century old. It feels like it's almost second nature to us human beings holding on to it. But what doesn't help is how the whole idea around this podcast, I'll be very honest with you, Marina, is to look at it more holistically, because the way the political system and the way the corporate power, how they've come together and ring fence this whole thing, suffering has only increased. And the sort of the benefit to these people who actually hold the power, who make the policies, who decide how much goes to what, what purse goes where, they've benefited out of this. There must be some hope, or is there no hope at all to wriggle out of it?
Of course, there is a lot of hope. Well, first of all, I'm an optimist, so I don't think I'd still be around if I didn't have any left. And I know I've been quite critical about the sector in my writing on LinkedIn, for example. But that's exactly because I have hope. It's exactly because I have hope, and I believe in its potential for doing beautiful things, for it becoming the true vehicle of solidarity. I have a neighbor here, and she makes jam, and she sells these jars of jam, and we often buy it with the kids when we go past her house. She just kind of has them set out there and just, leave £5 or however much you want to give. And then she gives the proceeds to one of the UK INGOs that works with communities affected by crisis, to this lady.
That's very enterprising.
Exactly. So yeah, but it's her expression of solidarity. I think if she knew better how the money was spent and how much money was basically sedimenting, at different layers before it reached the communities, she would be upset. But the drive for her and for many other people who give generously in this country and other countries in the global north or in the global south. It's real. The solidarity is real. I think it's been kind of instrumentalized and preyed on under different guises of, capacity building, a risk reduction, or I don't know, risk management, etc. But because of people like herself, and because of people I've seen in, displacement camps in South Sudan, where they would receive a cash grant to a few carefully selected households, because, you can't give it to everyone. You just painstakingly select the most vulnerable ones. And then you return 2 weeks later and you learn that they've just put it all together and spread it evenly across everyone, because community cohesion, solidarity matters to people regardless where they are. And I think if we kind of learn to or tap into this vision of the global solidarity between each other, between ourselves as this one big global village, big displacement camp, I don't know, global community, again, idealistic, I know.
But why? We should be talking like this. We should be making it more of a deal, because the narrative, I'm very critical, and that way, last 2-3 years has changed me quite a lot, what I've seen, because I used to mouth the same old narrative around what the leaders say. Try not to lean on the left, try not to lean on the right. We have to talk about the idealistic solution. I know, Marina, you've been very modest in batting away the role as an innovator, but there needs to be more made out of individuals like you who are doing that job, who are finding new ways to get out to people at every level, whether that is sort of basic funding, whether that is policy making, or in some cases, which I know, just educating a group of people both within the system and outside the system so that they could connect together. So more power to you, more power to you in terms of being idealistic and writing those things which you write and how you write beautifully.
Thank you. I think it's one thing to be idealistic in your 20s when you're still idealistic in your 40s. I think that probably says something, right? And I think it's, I don't know, a lot of the good things that have worked and that I've seen work in the sector have been basically built on that, on idealism, on trust. They have rarely been really, these pragmatic solutions. They've been done out of trust, out of solidarity, out of recognition of, I don't know, shared humanity. And that's what I've seen really flourish, people coming together, across borders, across communities. And that's the whole thing. I think the biggest burden, the biggest obstacle for the sector is that we constantly undervalue the people we claim to be serving. And don't get me wrong, I've met many downright sacrificial decisions made by people from all parts of the world who wanted to stay in the sector, who, agreed to cut their own salaries to maintain the meaningful work, because, there's one budget. There's salaries, there is the programmatic budget. So if you pay yourself more salary, you're going to have money left for the more substantial work. And I've seen people say, I know this leader in the Philippines, where she said, well, of course I can pay myself a bigger salary, but what's the point, right? And she's amazing, right? And I've seen people do this all the time. So I don't want to say that, people in the sector are mercenaries. I think they're always good. And I just think we need to do away with this perception of the majority world people who so far tend to be the main recipients of all these assistance programs as people who are shaped by what they don't have. Because I was thinking about it the other day, and I remembered a conversation I had with a few subsistence farmers in Zimbabwe a couple of years ago. I had a focus group discussion with them about something completely unrelated, and then our car was late and they were still very engaged, and I decided to ask them a question I never asked, and I'm the accountability person, have been that for over a decade. And I asked them, when people like us, local, international, come to your communities and say they want to help, what should we do? What should we stop doing? In 15 minutes, they gave me the whole rundown of all the international standards I spent years learning and teaching. They said, talk to each other. There's a ton of you. You all come with the same questions. Talk to our local government. Don't ignore them. Don't pollute the environment. Like all that stuff they distribute, don't wrap it in plastic. It's hard for us to clean it up later. When you come up with livelihoods programs, please bear in mind the land rights issues. We sometimes don't have access to the land. So if you design something that assumes we do, it's going to be hard and it's not sustainable. Help us build back better. I mean, they didn't say it in those words. That's kind of a sector link. But make sure that women and children are protected, the older people, people with this, like, make it safe to disagree with you. That thing stuck with me. Make it safe to disagree with you. Those people that I thought were completely preoccupied with their immediate needs, and a question like that would be too abstract, immediately engaged like this. They were not highly educated. They were obviously very wise from all that life that they led and all that exposure to the sector they have had throughout their lives. And the question was not all that theoretical, was not all that abstract to them. They immediately told me everything, even mentioned climate change. The weather is changing, and the crops we used to previously use are no longer serving us because droughts or floods or whatever. And it was humbling. And it was after 10 years of working in that space where I was constantly pushing through policy, through changed practices, changing hearts, minds, systems, processes to make our work more community-centric. And there's a ton of people like me doing the same thing, but I never asked. So basically, where I'm going with this is that we need to always question ourselves. Of course, we can all try to be allies. It's good when somebody eventually calls you that, but you are never done. There's a ton of conditioning. There's so many layers of conditioning and assumptions you need to work through, peel away, to finally see those communities that are sitting across from you during those focus group discussions as absolutely equal humans, capable of the same insight as yourself. And that's uncomfortable because it challenges your authority as an expert, but it's absolutely necessary. And I'm confident that if we continue doing that, then there is hope.
I think it all starts with a very simple fact that the least we could do coming from far afield is give them agency. They have their own agency, and we need to recognize that. More importantly, individuals are capable of, and if given a platform, if given a choice in terms of what they can make out of their own life without being dependent on, what the other part of the world thinks about them. Coming back to the whole system within which you operate, looking at the livelihood, innovation, and community partnership, is there something we can change? Or do you think it's a system unlike the other corporate world? It's working all right. And we just need more focus, more spotlight, and more teasing, if I may call, in different parts of the world.
I would like to start by saying that there are incredibly brilliant initiatives that are currently being implemented. However, systemically speaking, I would say they are the outliers. Generally, the system is geared towards short-term funding. It's prone to fads, chasing the next shiny thing, focusing your innovation on that. I remember a few years ago, it was all about blockchain. Now it's all about AI. And I'm not saying AI is a fad, but now whenever you see calls for proposals for some innovation initiatives, you can often see that these things are encouraged. Believe that the best innovation would happen if we give more freedom to communities and those who work with them, so local organizations, and the freedom should come in the form of multi-year funding. If you are
sustainable funding.
When you're given like 6 months to innovate, now innovate. It's very hard, right? And if you're given very prescriptive idea of what you innovate and which boxes it needs to fit, it's probably not going to genuinely happen. In one of my previous organizations, I ran Innovation Challenge for a couple of years, and I could see that it was difficult to get people innovating when you tell them it's time to innovate, and then you give them a little bit of seed funding, and then you want to learn what happens 6 months later. So it's not a realistic cycle. It should be safe to fail, and you should be allowed to organically innovate. And for that, I think the best and the most boring but essential thing is multi-year funding. Nowadays, the sector is running on ridiculously short funding timeframes: 6 months, 9 months, 8 months, 12 months, 18 months if you're lucky. 2 years is a luxury. I've never met anything more than 3 years. I know they say they're 5-year grants. So more direct funding for local organizations, I would say, would enable that to happen. And longer.
And that would also break the monopoly of the bigger funding agencies of how they operate, because they get very comfortable up top. 80-90% of the funding flows through that channel, isn't it? So you're talking about the more local organizations being given time. And when you talk about 6 months, you are going against the philosophy of innovation, which you mentioned in terms of failing. Failing is part of the innovation, isn't it? You got to give them time so that they could work on what their plan is, and something good can come out of that because they're involved heavily in the context and the local community.
Exactly. And you need to also kind of widen your perception, the range of what's possible, as somebody recently told me. Widen the solution space, I think. Innovation can take different forms. It can take time. Yes, might go through several stages of failure. And I remember saying, you can fail, just don't fail to learn. But ultimately, we don't want you to fail. Right? So
we know the feeling, the overarching message around what we mean by failing. That's very important.
And I think we need to honestly and really explicitly disconnect innovation from tech. I mean, if you need tech, your innovation project idea, of course, go for it. But you don't have to. I remember while running those innovation challenges within my previous organization, working with 52 country offices and multiple partners, 200 partners, I received a lot. Like the biggest FAQ was, does it have to be about tech? No, it doesn't. But people often assume. So since it's such a common assumption, it needs to be that you don't have to do that. It's okay. It can be doing the same things in different ways. And it might have nothing to do with tech. I mean, to be honest, in my time in the sector, I've seen graveyards of technology. Were once, thriving pilots of some next innovation drive or whatever. And then you go and you see them. Like I remember in the middle of one of the northern provinces in South Sudan, we stopped in a local government office for kind of a quick meet and greet. And in the backyard of that building, I saw a ton of tractors from Belarus, of all places. I recognized, the name from my childhood. And I asked the leader of that administrative unit where the tractors came from. And he said, yeah, well, now they are all basically unusable because we can't get any spare parts for them. And they didn't come with a service agreement, anything like that. So as soon as they started breaking, that was it for that. And I know it's just a tractor. It's not particularly innovative. But I think many initiatives that were centered around more innovative technology suffered the same.
I think it feels like we could go into a different conversation altogether when we talk about technology, because that's one part which I would love to take your view on it maybe for another time. But you're absolutely right in terms of looking what is the thesis of innovation, how much time we're talking about, and how it's so intrinsically linked to technology in the current time. I just have a few more questions and then we'll wrap up the session. This is a quick one. So in your sector, if there was one myth which you felt you could best based on your experience and everything you've done to the outside world, what would that be?
I know, I'm just so spoiled for choice, Yeah, I would say still, I would go back to the same thing. People are just like yourself in very different circumstances. They want the same things for their families. What's the best way to support it? They are not that different. And I think a lot of good trouble should come out of that. Recognize the same type of humans. I've spoken to women in refugee camps and in difficult, disaster affected communities all over the world, and they're absolutely the same people. They look slightly different, they dress slightly differently, they might not share a language or a faith, but people want the same things, and they do not want to receive humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian assistance is something that people receive only when they've exhausted every other avenue of providing for themselves and their communities and their families. So that's it. Their dependency and all of that, it's something that might come from poorly designed programs. People do not want to be dependent. People do not want handouts. People are full of agency, and as long as we remove the barriers for that, they will exercise it.
Have them on equal footing. So my last question before we part of ways, Rina, is seeing yourself, the human cost of working in this sector. How have you coped with it? How have you worked around it? And where you are mentally right now with all these works behind you?
Reckoning, I guess, is the word that comes to mind first.
Yeah.
I think I know that I've started really examining my role in the sector over the last couple of decades. Yeah. And I am left with a lot of uncomfortable memories where I, at the time, thought I was doing the right thing. And now I look back and I wince thinking, that I could have done things better. I could have fought harder for some things. I could have spoken louder. It's been a journey.
Mhm.
You can sometimes start in the sector as a complete savior. I don't think it was my starting point. And transition to that place where your recognition of people as equals finally clicks, the light bulb goes on. I know you're probably asking me about things like PTSD, etc. Seeing people affected by emergencies and all of that is difficult, but it's not the most uncomfortable thing right now that I'm grappling with, to be honest with you. The sense of helplessness, etc. When you arrive to a community and you have only that much money, but everyone is affected, but you can't support everyone. It's difficult. It's very, very humbling, and obviously it makes you feel very guilty because you suddenly start playing God while absolutely not being qualified for that and not wanting to. So, but the most uncomfortable things come from a place where, I could see injustice or processes, programs designed still with a very colonial mindset. And I either didn't see it, didn't name it, and that I probably benefited from it. And this has been the most difficult part for me. And I am trying to go on this journey of reflection through my writing and speaking out. And sometimes people come and say, where were you? Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you do something? It's been a journey. I'm speaking up now. It's better late than never.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. This has been such a revealing conversation. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I would say your humanity and that honesty. I spoke to you about power. I spoke to you about accountability, which you very well explained to all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tabish. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. The stories we've shared today, it reminds us that the most transformative entrepreneurship, these are not happening just in boardrooms. It's actually happening in communities where people, they choose solidarity over competition. They choose care over profit. And if something resonated with you today, I'd love for you to share this episode. Please share it with someone who's building something meaningful, someone who believes businesses should heal rather than extract, someone who knows that real innovation happens when we put people first. And until next time, please keep questioning, keep building, and keep proving that entrepreneurship can be a force for good. I am Dr. Tabish Zaman, and this has been one of the episodes of Builders of the Broken Bazaar.